Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 12th of October, and today we're beginning by looking at Kupyansk for a change. Then we're going to zoom in on the Dobropillya Pocket because the Russians have been able to really solidify it in recent days. And we'll finish off with the Yanchur River line. The eastern bank has now been cleared. We're going to look at a lot of the troop redeployments by both the Russian and Ukrainian sides, and the Russian redeployments are actually going to tell us a lot about what they expect for the near future. So it's going to be a really interesting video if you're interested in that sort of stuff. But we're also going to look at the topographic map to the north of Pokrovsk. So a lot to get into. But I will begin with Kupyansk over here. We have three individual changes in a lot of reporting that I want to go through because both sides have been able to give some input given the situation over here. So just to begin, you could see over here that within the city itself, the Russians continue deepening their western and eastern flanks. So the eastern flank being the one that runs along the western coast of the Oskil River. And you could see how the Russians just pursued this route of advance and were able to seize a lot of these dachas and reach the downtown area of the city. Let's actually zoom in on it because the Russians have made further inroads in recent days. They captured what amounts to 15 hectares worth of territory, including a couple of these low rises, but also a market, and there's a repair shop. So a lot of these businesses, and some of them being 2 or 3 story buildings in this area. And nearby, there are a lot of other structures that remain in the gray zone. So the Ukrainians can no longer use them with the same degree of safety that they may have been able to a couple of weeks ago. And there's obviously degrees of safety within the city. For instance, Ukrainian forces that are using this structure near the school or near the warehouses over here are certainly going to be in a better position than the ones that are located near this gray zone that runs along Vulitsia, Privok, Zalna, for instance, this location. And they're going to be in a much better state than the ones that are currently holding out in this outstretched pockets, because the Ukrainians, they are really relegating the width and they're just trying to hold on to one particular narrow area because it ensures that there isn't any sort of centralized connectivity in the city between the two Russian flanks. And that way it acts as a burden on the Russians as they pursue their capture of this urban center, and it can be used to assault the Russian rear, for instance, over here, or just to dig in and try to just act as a nuisance. But regardless of the reasoning for why the Ukrainians continue holding out over here, the bottom line is that their salient continues to get narrower and narrower, and it continues to extend in a vertical direction. So previously, the salient perhaps amounted to 1.3 kilometers because the Russians were basically at the end of the salient near the corridor that leads out of it, near the local museum, for instance, or near the rail station. But they've basically just bypassed it. They're ignoring the Ukrainians that are situated over here. Instead of assaulting them head on, they're just simply letting them remain in the basements or in the high rises near the sort of ground zero, near the Spartak Stadium, for instance, or near, for instance, Vulitsia Ukrainska. And instead, they're diverting resources towards pushing deeper and deeper into the city. That's why we saw them capture over the past 2 days this part of downtown Kupyansk, which is actually near the main intersection in the city. So they've taken that over, and that will give them the opportunity to continue advancing southwards and cross over this low-lying part of the city where you have the Kupyanka River. And then from there, they'll have access to the entirety of the R79 highway on the southern edge of southwestern Kupyansk, you can say. From there, it's basically just low rises. This part of Kupyansk that the Russians are now reaching is less difficult to seize than the portions they've already taken over to a large degree. Now, if you zoom in over here on the dynamics within southern Kupyansk, it's all low rises. Yes, there are some plots of open fields, gardens. There are some high rises when you look at the Jubilee district, which is its own sort of island now. A lot of Ukrainians are resisting in this area, so you do have several squads that are holding out, using this as their forward operating post, whereas a lot of the other Ukrainians that are still situated within the city, they're holding out within this structure or this compound with several major buildings, for instance, the school, and there are a couple of other major structures in this location. And so that's still under solid Ukrainian control, but the Russians are getting very close to it, both from the east, where they're only 500 meters away, and then from the west, you look at it, and the gray zone is only 100 or 200 meters away from this location. So we're reaching the point where nowhere in the city is really safe and is outside of a gray zone. And when we say gray zone, we're defining it as the maximum distance that Russian DRGs can reach before they get killed. And by now, DRGs are really seeping in farther and farther, and they're paving the way for Russian forces, assault troops from the 27th Motor Rifle Division, which is, of course, Motor Rifle Brigade, that is actually heralding this assault and is the one that's responsible for a lot of the cutting-edge maneuvers in this location. That's, of course, being done in conjunction with a lot of these newly formed motor rifle regiments that don't have logos because they're so new, but you can see them over here. And let's zoom back in because I want to look at the tactical situation again. The Russians on the western flank have captured 0.85 square kilometers of territory. And this is being, very conservative because I'm going to mention in a moment the Russian estimates. But let's begin by looking at the fact that they've taken over this span of Ulitsia Lermontova. So the Ukrainians did try to resist and hold out within this part of Kupyansk, which is a bit isolated from the rest of southern Kupyansk, because in between them you have the forest and you have a couple of roads. So the connectivity was poor, but the reason why the Ukrainians tried holding out over here was in order to prevent the Russians from getting access to the forested patches that are located around Sobolivka, because then from there Russian DRGs can seep into it and can either expand past Kupyansk to the west, taking advantage of the highway branching out of it and then reaching the whole host of villages that are located around the western perimeter of the city, or it can be used in order to allow the Russians to flank many of the key defensive nodes like the Jubilee district and then just immediately reach the southern end of Kupyansk, for instance, along this road over here, and then from there to reach Vulitsia, Levadna, and try to cut off the southern road into Kupyansk. And so those sort of potential threats are what goaded the Ukrainians into remaining in their forward positions over here. But they were eventually stretched out and had no way to continue resupplying their garrison over here, and so they had to withdraw. The Russians are now taking it over and have fully consolidated their gains, and they've already expanded past this location. So they've expanded past what is referred to as Vulitsia, Tarasa, Shevchenko, and they are already making their way southwards. They've arrived at the outskirts of the Jubilee district near this garage and car wash region as well. And as a result, they're making inroads into the southernmost district of Kupyansk, as well as this sort of diagonal road that branches out into the city. So that's pretty much the demarcation line between the DRGs and where the Ukrainians are holding. But for the time being, we're just going to say that this is the polygon that they actually have been able to fully take over. And from now here on in, they're going to try to expand that, obviously. And you can see how it's reaching a critical mass. It's reaching a boiling point because the Ukrainians, at a minimum, have a corridor that spans 220 meters, and that's it when it comes to the salient. Now, there are other portions that are a bit wider, but that doesn't really matter because the Russians are going to focus all of their efforts on cutting off the most narrow parts of this entire salient. And once we reach a certain distance, the number becomes meaningless because, in effect, you could fire on either end and it would reach the other side of it. Whether it be through smaller arms, through any sort of rocket-propelled munition, or whether it be drone crews that are operating nearby, snipers, artillery fire certainly isn't really a concern over here. The Russian artillery batteries, if you're asking me, not on the western edge of the Volga River, they have to be on the eastern edge still, probably in some of the open parts of the forest, some of the open patches within the forested regions like Liman Perishi, or even a bit to the north. The forward mortar crews, they certainly are stationed to the west of the Volga River, and they are also involved in the daily minutia of fighting around here. But either way, it's reaching a point where the Ukrainians will be forced out, and at the same time, the Russians aren't really attriting their forces to the maximum degree, trying to attack this area head on, because they've already, just allowed the Ukrainians to remain, shaped over there in that cauldron, while they try to attack with depth and try to undermine the southern parts of Kupyansk. And undergirding that will ensure that the entirety of the city then falls. And from there, it's already interesting because there's going to be a lot of implications for the eastern part of Kupyansk, and moreover, the 100-200 square kilometer eastern bank of the Volga River, which is an area that, again, will have to be addressed. You look at the supply lines over here. One of them goes through the city of Kupyansk itself and has essentially been cut off due to the recent advances. So that would be this bridge over here. They've been destroyed numerous times and then rebuilt via pontoons. And so I wouldn't really take anything written over here about bridge, quote unquote, destroyed as being gospel because these are old polygons, these are old icons. And in the time since, the Ukrainians have also set up new sort of fjords or new rafts or new pontoons in new locations, not just in areas where there was a bridge previously. And so all of those would have to be cut off. And you have a couple of the other existing bridges to the south that have still not been physically taken over by the Russians and may or may not be in service. And so, yeah, certainly there's still ways to move across, but it's going to be far more difficult. And it's going to really speed up the process of clearing out the bridgehead. But the Ukrainians will not withdraw in any sort of like immediate way because it will be ceding far too much territory and so many really key defense nodes when you look at it. So many villages that did have potential for, lasting a very long time amidst a frontal Russian assault. And there were a lot of trenches built over here as well. So there are many fallback lines that the Ukrainians can, withdraw towards if they're seeing that they're overextended due to the logistical bottlenecks. So withdrawing fully is not the only option. There are other options over here, even though the Ukrainian garrison is weakened. It's been stripped of a lot of its forces near, for instance, Stepovo-Novoselivka or Pischane or Petropavlivka, because for the most part, they're being concentrated on Kupyansk itself. And on that note, recently, the 144th Mechanized Brigade was redeployed from Chernihiv because it was the only full brigade deployed to that region that was actually involved in like the northern tip of Ukraine, trying to repel Russian DRGs and just being stationed there on the rear. But simply the Ukrainians have to do trade-offs, and so it's absolutely necessary for as many forces as possible to be defending both south and west of Kupyansk. And that's why the Ukrainians made the decision in late September to move in this unit. So they're also engaged in the fighting. And on that note, the Ukrainians actually on October 11th, they were targeted and shelled in this forested patch that is just to the west of Radkivka, indicating that the Ukrainians were able to push the Russians back about 1.2 square kilometers. So this is a notable advance. And it's one that amounts to about 2 kilometers. Now, it's possible that perhaps my map was just overestimating the Russian sphere of influence over here and that they never had full control of the rail line from Tishenshivka all the way to Moskovka. That's certainly a possibility, but I did change it based on available geolocated data at the time. And it's certainly possible that since then there was a change in, this part of the front line north of Kupyansk has endured a lot of vicissitudes, so it wouldn't be shocking, but I'm still going to mark it as being newly acquired territory just within the context of my map, so you guys are able to see what I've changed over here. So you guys can see that they were shelled by the 2nd Battalion of the 27th Motor Rifle Brigade, the main Russian unit involved in the Kupyansk operation. And the Ukrainians, they are trying to hold out over here because it does present some challenges for the P-79 highway or R-79 highway, whatever you want to call it, because Kinrashivka serves as one of the main outlets into the Russian battalions that are involved in the day-to-day fighting in Kupyansk. So now having the Ukrainians, even if they did not physically cut it off, and even if they can't, having them present nearby means that they can conduct ambushes on the ground to try to disrupt supply movements. So that's the goal behind it, and it also prevents a unification between the Russian forces to the west of Kinrashivka with the ones that are currently settling in and have been for a while now within Moskovka, because having them connected and unified would then give them the opportunity to push past the rail line and towards these various other villages that are located even past Kupyansk and in other parts of the Kharkiv region. And it would essentially be a part of the Velika Shapkivka line, which is a town that, of course, during the Kharkiv counteroffensive was captured by the Ukrainians, and it's rather large. I want to see if it has fortifications mapped over here. Yeah, there are some fortifications near Mala Shapkivka, so those are some locations that have been built up by the Ukrainians, and there's actually a paved road that connects them all together. So that's a network or a line of Ukrainian villages that certainly will be a target in the future, but it's not really relevant to today's video and won't be here for a while, in my opinion. But in any case, it's always interesting to look at those sort of secondary, tertiary fronts. Now, let's zoom in on what's going on in Pokrovsk and Dobropillya, because there are many updates from this region. To begin with, the Russians have started to just fully close the Yanchur pocket. And this is a big deal because it ensures that the logistics into the Kucher VR salient are now protected. They're now going to have far more leeway when it comes to movement of forces in, including through vehicles, because up until now, it was so difficult for the Russians to move in any sort of heavy equipment. They couldn't enter into the salient at all with armored vehicles or tanks, even if they were extremely well built and had cope cages and slat armor and everything that is needed in order to protect it to the fullest extent. Because it was so deep within an area where the Ukrainians could have drone coverage along each flank, it simply wasn't feasible. And so the Russians largely supplied their forces over here on foot or through drones. And that caused a lot of restrictions when it came to the operational freedom for the Russian forces. They couldn't really organize large-scale attacks over here while their logistics were so poor. But due to the Nikhanorivka pocket closing, that's going to be far easier in the future. So the Russians, within the context of this pocket closing, were able to retake 11.2 square kilometers, and it's a push of about, 5.5 kilometers westwards. The Ukrainians from the 80th Air Assault Brigade, that's the unit that was involved in their push into Nikhanorivka, and then from there into Boykivka, actually. There was a period in time where they were able to infiltrate into Boykivka and Novotorets before being pushed back. That was sort of the apex for the Ukrainians over here. So, in addition to the 80th Brigade, the 1st Battalion of the 158th Mechanized Brigade was working in tandem with them. So, remember, 158th is a unit that's actually supposed to be deployed to Kupyansk, but at this point it's been stripped of all of its battalions, and they're operating across various other parts of the front line, including in Sumy. So, for instance, Battalion number 2, I think, that's operating, in the Sumy region, just to the south of Kindrativka and Andrivka. But back to the 1st Battalion. They were involved, and we could see this based on missing persons reports that I was able to find, and now they've been pushed back, and those missing persons, they were counted as missing in Boykivka because they forayed into an area that was just extremely far away from their main organization nodes, like, for instance, Dobropillya or Belitske or even Rodinske, and they may have been captured or they may have been killed in one of the sort of forested brushes to the west of the Kazenyi Torets River over here. But in any case, this means that now the Russians have 7 kilometers in terms of their corridor into the salient. So that's going to be far easier when it comes to sort of future movement of forces. You look now at the next objectives for the Russians, and it would probably be to just expand the salient even further, and that would entail closing the Ukrainian presence in Novoshachove, Ivanivka, and Dorozhny, because these currently serve as forward outposts for counterattacks in the future, or simply act as thorns in Russia's western flank that prevent any sort of flexibility with movement near some of these paved roads, because for the most part, the paved roads into the Kucherov salient, they're very concentrated in the eastern parts of the salient, not necessarily in the western section. There aren't many vertical roads. And the ones that do exist, for instance, the routes that run along the rail line from Dorozhny to Novoshachove, they actually are partially at least under Ukrainian control. So those have to be taken over in order to improve and streamline the process. So that's one objective, but actually, on this note, the Ukrainians, some of them, so Deep State in this case, they have made some updates and adjusted their map. First of all, they acknowledge the fact that the Nikhanorivka pocket is largely fallen, although there may be some gray zone left. There may be some Ukrainian forces remaining trying to hold out in a couple of houses and bushes, but the Russians are currently clearing it out, and that would probably be from the 110th Brigade, but there are other ones over here as well that are involved in the activities. Now, the thing is, you look at this region and the Deep State mapping from the past couple of days, they claim that they've been able to just now take back this location. So south of Zolty Koludyaz, there's this local ravine that branches out to the south, and then to the east of it, there are a couple of open fields and some outcroppings from the main ravine. And they're claiming this is a new advance, but this has been the case for a while. Ever since the Ukrainians counterattacked, going back 2 months ago, they've had, to some degree, give or take, presence over here. And I always acknowledge that, and I changed my map to account for that at the time. And so I have no reason to, yet again, update the map to indicate that they counterattacked as of recent, because that's simply not the case. They've always been here, and they've been trying to apply pressure on Kucherov from the west. But no, this is not a recent advance. And at the same time, they're claiming that the Ukrainians took over the entirety of Novoshachove, and that in the same sort of breath, they also took back all of Vilny. So the Deep State map is a bit different from my categorization and from many others, both from the Ukrainian and Russian side. They still claim, despite the fact that it's been 2 months, that Kucherov and then this open area near the quarries
are two separate pockets that are completely cut off, that there's a gray zone in between them. The Russians don't have direct access to them. They have to fight their way through to reach the pockets. And so they've been talking about this sort of encirclement. Perhaps they don't say that in their own words when you look at their reporting in written form, but on the map, the implication certainly is that they're just completely isolated over there, even though it's been 2 months. And so, no, that's not the case. The salient over here, it did suffer from a lot of logistical shortages, but it was never fully cut off. And especially in recent days, the corridors expanded, and now the connectivity is stronger than it ever was, the strongest ever, because to say even at the beginning, when the Russians reached Kucherov and took it over, they were advancing along a very thin route, and they hadn't really stabilized the situation on their flanks. So the situation now is better than it has been in a while, and you will really have Novoshakov acting as a sort of final base of resistance. And some Ukrainians claim that they have fully taken it over, which is possible, but we just have to wait for footage or some sort of satellite imagery to back it up. But they certainly do control at least part of it. And from there, they can cause issues when it comes to just direct fire onto this width of the corridor, which spans about 4 kilometers. And that's a part of why there is a rationale in taking it over from a Russian perspective. But at the same time, another area where the Ukrainians are on the back foot every single day now is the Kazenyi Torets River line. So west of Shehove, the Russians took over 1.9 square kilometers of territory. Looking at their advance, they pushed about 1.5 kilometers eastwards, so near this pond and near this tree line, and they're advancing along a already sort of established route that's been used before. Maybe there's a gravel road over here, and from there they can actually enter into Shehove. So the preparations are underway for an attack on the Kazenyi Torets River line and all of its accompanying villages from the east, south, and west. For the longest time, the eastern flank was the strongest, and the Ukrainians naturally deployed forces to address that due to the presence of so many Russian Marine brigades. You have 155th, 40th, 177th Regiment, and then 61st Brigade. And they've all been involved in the advances to the east and also to the south in relation to the capture of much of Volodymyrivka. So for now, they've been able to get control over a lot of these hills that overlook the river line, and you could see how that provides a perfect line of sight into the road and into the valley that connects all of them, and then also a great line of fire to target them as they're doing, their defensive duties. The Russians are only, when you look at it from this paved road, about 1.7 kilometers away from Sofivka. So they're really closing in on it and tightening the noose. So movement in and out for any armored vehicle becomes increasingly difficult. And the Ukrainian garrison over here has to really rely on forces that are hiding in basements or drone crews that are trying to repel the mechanized assaults. And they can do it up until a certain degree. But as we saw with the attacks that occurred on October 10th, wherein the Russians utilized 40 tanks and armored vehicles and 35 motorcycles, or I think it was the other way around, 40 motorcycles, 35 AFVs and tanks, and they advanced along 2 main routes. One of them being over here to the southeast of Shehove, and another one directly to the south of Volodymyrivka. A lot of those vehicles were stopped in their tracks around here and also around here, but others were able to pour through. It's a very porous front, and given the scale and intensity of the assault combined with the weather conditions with a lot of fog and rainfall, they were able to successfully cross line of contact and change the status quo in a significant way, meaning they were able to take back 11.4 square kilometers during that singular October 10th assault that lasted the entire day because there were several waves of them. Now, this is important because they were able to alleviate a lot of the pressure that Ukrainian DRGs were exerting through operating near Novotoretsk. So they were able to advance 4 kilometers northwards. Beforehand, the Ukrainians had this ability to reach Novotoretsk, and the fear was that they would be able to unify with the DRGs near Boykivka and then fully cut off not just the Kucherov Yar salient, but also areas like Pankivka and Mayak. So that was the fear, but now that's really dissipated due to the recent advances. And this has been done again on this road, and we've been able to confirm further Russian advances on this day due to recent geolocations. So there's a video of the Phoenix FPV group. I think it's associated with just the National Guard in general. I have them on the map over here. And they are responsible for a lot of the strikes. So in this case, they struck a Russian tank, and that indicates they were pushing along this route. And then over here, one of the motorcycles that also pushed from the southeast was destroyed as it was making its way to Shachove past Volodymyrivka. And so at this point, it's very likely that most of the village, if not all of it, is no longer under Ukrainian control because it's separated by the river, and simply a safer fallback line will be Shachove. The size of Volodymyrivka, its very compact nature, means that with the sort of numbers described, between 50 to 75 forces that were involved in landing over here, it would be very difficult for any opposing force to remain around there unless they're in some sort of hole near the outskirts. So that's all when it comes to that advance that we covered already. And you could clearly see how there's directionally, an effort to attack over here. We also saw the same thing with the west and with the east, as we've established previously. And all of it is beginning to close in on the pocket, which, I'm going to just very roughly draw it and measure its size. But there are a lot of notable villages around here that are home to a lot of important Ukrainian units that have been involved in the defensive efforts over here and attempts at closing the Yanchur River pocket for 2 months. So it spans about 50 square kilometers. So it's a non-trivial amount of territory, including Torets, Sofivka, Shachove, and Volodymyrivka. Then from there, the problem is, let's say that falls, you're going to have a very clear route to advance along this road and then eventually reach the southwestern outskirts of Druskivka. And that's why we talked about for a while how the advance of Yanchur River, yes, there is a level of importance in relation to the Dobropillya. That's always been understood. But there's also a far deeper concern about how this can eventually all tie together and then eventually reach Ukraine's rear, and one of their key cities on the rear being Druskivka. And the Ukrainians were able to, of course, stymie this effort for 2 months with their counterattacks and redeployment of forces, but now it's reached the same situation that it was at 2 months ago in mid-August, and at this point, the Ukrainians have already exhausted the redeployments, and the redeployments are either needed to defend elsewhere, they need to hold the current line, and there's not much that can be done to replenish them, or they actually have to be routed slightly to the south to defend in an area like Rodinske or within Pokrovsk and Myrhorod itself. So that's a problem. Right now, I can't really think of a massive contingent of forces like the one that was moved in August to actually deal with a future offensive towards Druskivka, because the Ukrainians are already trying to defend in Konstantinivka with reinforcements that were moved in from elsewhere. Same thing with the Yanchur River line, something with Kupyansk. And so that's the problem with this. And that's why the fact that the Russians were able to bear the brunt of the counterattacks for so long, it's actually now beginning to pay off for them. Now, let's zoom in because we've talked about that for enough. I want to look at Pokrovsk and Myrhorod. So in Rodinske, the Russians always had a foothold in the northeast, and now they've advanced southwards, capturing 0.9 square kilometers. A video from the 3rd Battalion of the 92nd Assault Brigade shows FPV strikes onto these Russian soldiers in southeastern Rodinske, and that again indicates to us that gradually it's the parts of Rodinske that are on the outskirts are chipped away at, and eventually it's going to fall, and it's not going to fall in a single moment, but it's just been a gradual collapse. And at this point, Rodinske isn't really of the same utility that it was before, because it's pretty much isolated. The fighting is just really reserved to the locality itself, and Rodinske, the forces over there can't really be used to assist with any other front. They're just involved in their own sort of island of defense, and it's not really connected to anywhere else at this point because it is so close to ground zero of the fighting, so logistics don't really go through over here unless it's to a force that's defending even further to the east in Chervony Liman, which is also a Russian goal right now. They want to take it over, which is why they've advanced to the east of Rodinske and also to the north of Chervony Liman, giving them the opportunity to attack using the vantage point along this Terracon and to actually storm the village itself. Now, at the same time, we've seen the Russians in this case advance north of Myrhorod and capture 1.2 square kilometers. This video is from the Typhoon FPV group, and they're deployed over here. They're a company in the National Guard, and you could see that they just dropped grenades and conducted FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers. And these soldiers are, at first they were just the DRGs, but now we're looking at actual assault forces. The DRGs just bypassed Chervony Liman because the resistance was too strong over there from, I think it was the 38th Marine Brigade. And so they have been operating for months now in this sort of very narrow corridor that is on relatively high elevation and does overlook much of Myrhorod. And so now they're beginning to actually finalize those advances, consolidate them, and that will be used in order to precipitate the entire collapse of the city. So for now, it's just 1.2 square kilometers, and in advance, if we're measuring it eastwards of about 1.2 3 kilometers. Looking at other parts of Myrnarod, we're seeing that there's an effort to just clear out the entire excess portion to the southeast of the city. Because for a while now, there's been a massive buffer zone that runs along the Kazenyi Torets River, and it's prevented head-on assaults towards Myrnarod or any of its southern outskirts. And so a lot of that sort of buffer region was bypassed because the Ukrainians, of course, conducted their counterattacks in Novoekonomichny and Mykolaiivka. So naturally, the Russians had no choice but to respond to that. So that was the work of the 5th Oplot Brigade and Sparta Reconnaissance Battalion and a whole other host of units that are deployed over here. You could see them on the map. So once they were able to turn the tide and just push back the Ukrainians from all of those forward positions, they were able to galvanize upon that, launched the first mechanized assaults that ever were, headed in the direction of this city. And using those mechanized assaults, now there were a lot of vehicular damages incurred, but they were able to land forces in these tree lines, in some of these outer trenches, and from there seep in their forces. You can see it on the map very clearly how those fortifications were overrun and continue to be overrun. And that gave the Russians the necessary positions to then advance southwards along forested areas and from there arrive at where we are today, which is Balakhan, which is one of the villages associated with the network south of Myrnarod. So we have a video over here from the Argus drone unit of the 38th Marine Brigade. Grenade drops onto Russian soldiers in the tree lines near this village. And so it's currently being stormed. It's very small in surface area. So once it is fully taken over, it will be used as a forward operating base for a small select group of Russian soldiers that can then branch out towards other small hamlets like Kozatske, Promin, etc. Russian sources claim that the entire eastern flank over here, this entire salient, has been taken over. This is not confirmed yet, but the Russians, if they have not already, they're certainly planning on this because that would provide them with a lot of freedom of movement between Hordivka and Novoekonomichny, and then the entire Kazenyi Torets River line will be free of any sort of Ukrainian entanglement on the ground, and from there, a lot of resources can move westwards to actually begin assaulting the city head-on. And this is all being done at a time where Rodinske, the capture of Rodinske, is speeding up, and the goal is, of course, to then cut off Pokrovsk from Hryshny and from any other supply routes to close in from the northeast. That was always the plan. It was the plan in August before the Ukrainians stabilized, and it still is the plan today. And we'll actually get to that now with Pokrovsk, but before that, just an advance that was recorded near Kotline. So Kotline, it's now been confirmed that pretty much all of it's under Russian control, and this did not happen overnight. This is just the building up of a lot of updates until it got my attention and I was able to verify it. So during this time period, 2.6 square kilometers were captured by the Russian side, and diagonally they advanced about 1.85 kilometers northeast. And I know a lot of Russian sources claim that, for instance, the line of contact runs along the rail line, or at the very least the T046. But the Ukrainians, they have this ability to hold out over here with very small groups of forces and are able to evade getting spotted by drone crews, or they're able to just evade the damages because they're concealed under the tree lines in these dugouts and underground compartments. And there are a lot of examples of that over here, for instance. Some of them marked on the trench map and others not. And I just have not seen proof that they were overrun. So I'm not going to change the map unless there's proof that backs it up, whether it comes from consensus from all sources or from some sort of geolocated footage or even satellite imagery. I also look at that. And I just have not seen proof of it yet. But I do know that there's been movement to the west of Pokrovsk with the intention of cutting off the access routes to, for instance, this road over here, the E50 highway, or even the road into Hryshny. So DRGs are trying to do that. And then from there, the hope for the Russians would be to then move in the assault squads to finalize those gains. But for now, the assaults are still sort of relegated to Durniak and have not expanded much. But in terms of Kotlina, this is where the Russians actually have advanced. So they took over the entirety of the residential areas, both in the southeast and northwest. They took over this mine region over here. They're getting very close to this other facility. You have a parking lot and a couple of agricultural warehouses. So that's a location that's currently contested. And the direction in which this is heading is that, yes, as Russian sources describe, all of the locations south of the rail line will be taken over. That includes all of the windbreaks, tree lines, dugouts, trenches. And then from there, it would close the gap needed in order to cut off the supply routes into Pokrovsk at a time where there's already immense pressure on the Ukrainians to defend within the city itself, to defend in Mirnorod, and to defend its northeastern flank in Ordinske. Not to mention all of the other associated fronts like the one in Dobropillya, which is fundamentally disconnected right now from what's going on in Pokrovsk when it comes to the tactical objectives, but it is intrinsically tied together when it comes to the deployment and disposition of forces. So that's, I think, it. But I do want to look at the troop deployments for the Russians because they've moved a lot of forces away from Pokrovsk, and that may come as a surprise to you guys because isn't there reaching its end game now? Isn't there a culmination? Well, that's entirely the point. The Russians understand that sooner or later Pokrovsk is going to fall in its entirety because of the entire... In essence, the Russians already have a presence along the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk, which then pins down Ukrainian forces over there. It forces them to remain situated over there, and they can't really deploy their forces elsewhere because any sort of movement out of it would give the Russians an opportunity to pour into the city itself through a direct assault. Now, that's something that is the case, but there was at least one brigade that was redirected from the city of Pokrovsk over the past couple of days that we'll get to later. But besides that, the same garrison has stayed very rigid over here since the summer. And at the same time, there's also the worry from the flanks, and so those have to be accounted for. And so everything's already in place for the eventual closure of this salient. It's really just a matter of time. And so the Russians know that with the current trajectory, it's going to close, so they can just already move forces elsewhere in the places where it's no longer as relevant. And the places where it's least relevant are, essentially the southern flank of Pokrovsk, the southern outskirts, for instance. Because, again, as we talked about, the intention over here is not for a head-on assault. That's something that could happen if the Ukrainians have the initiative and they withdraw their forces and move them elsewhere. But if that does not happen and they continue getting tied down over here, then the Russians have no incentive to basically buy into that and just sort of go band for band over here. So they're just moving their forces elsewhere while they pursue and actually beef up their forces to the northeast and try to pressure the Ukrainians through the flanks. And so let's look at the examples. You have the 35th Brigade, Motor Rifle Brigade, 55th Motor Rifle Brigade as well, and I need to find them on the map. You have the 74th Brigade, and they're deployed into this region as well. I need to just find them as well for you guys so you can see. And also the 137th Motor Rifle Brigade or Assault Brigade, whatever it's called. So I can't find the 74th, but it's also deployed over here. So that's 4 brigades worth of forces that previously were stationed around Shevchenko and perhaps even further to the north, and now they're being redirected to Novopavlivka. That indicates very clearly that the preparations are now underway for an assault on Novopavlivka. And that would actually go hand in hand with the recent Russian assaults towards Filia. So the Russians are already looking elsewhere at crossing over the border and reaching another major settlement. And they know that they don't really need to double down on where they already have been able to get a foothold in the southern section of Pokrovsk, essentially. That's the logic behind it. Now, looking at the Yanchur River Valley, just very minor advances for today. We can see that the entire eastern bank has been taken over. So the polygon over here, 2.4 square kilometers. East of Poltavka, about 1.2 kilometers worth of territory taken over. That also includes some of the houses in its northern northern part of Poltavka, or more aptly, the southeastern parts of the town. It's running diagonally southeastwards, so that's what would fit best. And so it's very narrow over here. The Russians just use their forward positions in the sections of Poltavka that are located to the east of the river. And then by proxy, we're able to cross over and situate themselves in the first houses. And now they're just in the process of clearing out the entirety of the village. So it's already largely under their control or in a gray zone. And then again, northwest of Malinivka, further expansion as the open fields that are all to the west of the Yanchur River really are not defended by anything. They're very susceptible to deep Russian infiltrations due to the porous nature of the defenses, no static defenses, very poor dugouts, and open fields that are very inviting for Russian assaults. A couple of key main roads, like this one over here, this horizontal one, leading to Vesela and Zeleny High, and not enough forces deployed. The Ukrainians simply have not sent in enough forces. But despite the fact they have moved in some reinforcements, but they've really concentrated them around Novoselivka, Sosnivka, Verona, Sichneve in order to counterattack over there. And they have been successful to a certain degree, but not enough to fundamentally change the situation. And that was done at the cost or the detriment of redeploying forces for a defensive purpose in areas located southwards, where the Russian gains have been, far more notable in recent weeks than the ones that are closer to the Yanchur River. So that was a debatable decision. But yeah, that's all I have for today. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.